For Krima Media's Polity, I'm Sane Dlamini. Political analyst Aubrey Majiqi discusses his latest column titled The Unravelling of Jacob Zuma. You mentioned a few disturbing incidences which indicates that our President Jacob Zuma no longer enjoys the support he enjoyed a decade ago. Why do you think he is turning a blind eye on the calls for him to step down?
Well, the first reason is our political system. Our political system has been uncompetitive for too long, over the past 23 years. And what it produced is the single-party dominance of the ANC, which insulated the ANC from bad decisions, including bad decisions that relate to the quality of leadership and the quality of leader that the party elects. So President Jacob Zuma himself has been insulated, despite his subjective weakness, by the single-party dominance of the ANC, which means there's been a disincentive for the party, first of all, and for him to change. And that has desensitized the party to some extent, and the president also, to the fact that outside the ANC, voter sentiment is changing to the detriment of the party. I think the president tends to focus more on what he believes he can control, that is internal ANC dynamics, because inside the ANC, the balance of support is still in his favor. Whereas what he must begin to worry about is the fact that despite the fact that he himself will be coming to the end of his presidential term as ANC president in 2017 and head of state in 2019, he must still help the ANC manage the external variable that is voter sentiment, because his image crisis is causing collateral damage to the ANC, as a result of which the ANC may lose in 2019 because of the damage his image crisis has caused to the ANC.
Is it worth mentioning now of how he was supported by the EFF leader, now General Secretary of the South African Federation of Trade Unions, Zwelinzima Mavavi, and even Blade Nzimande, since they are all singing a different tune now?
Well, I do think that when we reach a point where we acknowledge that our political decisions in the past, and in this case I'm talking about the political decision to support President Jacob Zuma in Polokwane, when we realize that that decision was incorrect, when we speak, we must speak with humility. And what that means to me is that, first of all, people like Zwelinzima Mavavi, Blade Nzimande, Julius Malema, as they are already doing, must accept that they made a mistake. But they must also accept what was visited upon the country because of that mistake, and then move on to do the second thing. They've been apologizing in general for the mistake they made. What they have not done is to apologize to individuals they persecuted in the process of supporting President Jacob Zuma in Polokwane and after Polokwane. That is the second thing they must do. They must apologize to those they persecuted. And humility demands that when they speak against the president, they must not speak as if they're saying something original. They must acknowledge that they are echoing what others said long before they started saying it.
Can you explain how sycophancy and hatred has ruined political support for Jacob Zuma?
Well, you have a moment when Zwelinzima Mavavi says Jacob Zuma is an unstoppable tsunami. You have a moment when Julius Malema says he can die or he can kill for Jacob Zuma. That's sycophancy. But you see, when a conflict is intimate, it is said that it tends to be quite fierce. So the fact that people like Vavi and Malema were so close to Jacob Zuma, so close to the agenda they thought he represented is precisely the reason that they've become some of his fiercest detractors at the moment, because they feel personally betrayed. Personally betrayed by the fact that there was a time when they believed he represented a particular agenda, only to find that he represents, in all possibility, the opposite of that agenda. So they, in political terms, hate him for misrepresenting himself.
Why do you say President Zuma's misfortune lie in the fact that he has become a metaphor for all things corrupt, venal, and lacking in probity?
Well, if you look at many a scandal around him, particularly in Nkandla, it's no longer controversial to argue that the president is a scandal magnet. It is no longer controversial also to argue that the president is scandal prone. I think what is controversial is the fact that the ANC has refused to acknowledge that he has caused and is causing damage to the party, first of all, and secondly, to the country. But they cannot do so, at least not sufficiently, because there is an extent to which, as a party, the ANC is culpable for what President Jacob Zuma has become, and therefore for what the ANC has become under his leadership and the leadership of those around him. But of course, to be fair, there is a growing number of ANC members and ANC leaders who want change. In other words, we may be approaching a point where a process of decoupling the interest of the party from the interest of the president is already afoot. The question is whether there is enough time for the ANC to change and avoid what may happen in 2019, that is, suffer a disastrous lack of confidence on the part of its supporters that may lead to it losing power in the general election.
You say under Zuma's watch, the alliance was destined to become the strategic center that will dictate the political, ideological, and policy content of the post-apartheid state. What went wrong?
Well, first of all, I do remember speaking at a conference of the Institute of Security Studies before Polokwane. And I argued at that conference that if a physician were to examine President Jacob Zuma, such a physician would not find a single left-wing bone in his body. And what I was responding to is the pretense of Zuma's allies that Zuma represented a left-wing agenda. And also the refusal to accept that what united them was not ideology. What united them in their support for President Jacob Zuma was not a policy platform. What united them was their common antipathy towards former President Thabo Mbeki. And therefore it is understandable that today we have a situation where people like Lady Nzimande, organizations like the SACP, some elements in COSATU and COSATU itself as a whole are now calling on him to step down as head of state, because there did come a point where even within the alliance there came a realization that the president did not represent a left-wing agenda. And to the extent that he may have promised that the alliance would be the strategic center from which policy content would be determined, the president misrepresented himself. Now, I don't know whether he made any such promise. What I do know is that there was such an expectation in Polokwane that the alliance, not the ANC, would be the strategic center. But in 2010, at the NGC of the ANC in Durban, the president made it very clear in his political report that it was the ANC not the alliance, that would be the strategic center that determined the content of policy and the direction the ANC would take. And I think that conceptual difference about what constitutes the strategic center between the alliance and the ANC is one of the reasons the line between sycophancy and hatred was crossed.
Again, under President Zuma's watch, Brian Molefe has been reinstated as ESCOM Chief Executive under a cloud following a release of a damning public protector's report into state capture, which raised Molefe's proximity to the controversial Gupta family. What do you think of the reaction from the ANC about Molefe's reinstatement?
Well, what we cannot run away from, and what the ANC and the president cannot run away from, is that there is a strong perception, if not a growing perception, amongst South Africans that the president has been captured by the Gupta family. And it is in that context that the events around Brian Molefe are being read by many citizens in the country. Now, the fact that the ANC is critical of the decision of the ESCOM board to reinstate Brian Molefe speaks to the impact of corruption and patronage on the ANC. Patronage, corruption coinciding with the factionalized political animal that the ANC has become. In that situation, power becomes dispersed and is therefore located in multiple centers. Some of the power is in the state, but within the state that power is contested. The power of the ANC as a center itself is contested. So what we used to call the center in the ANC splits into multiple centers. And these multiple centers come into competition and ultimately into conflict with one another. And this is what is happening now. Some centers of the collapsed center of the ANC have come out in conflict against the president and those around him as an alternative center. Now, of course, those who support Jacob Zuma may argue that people like Kwete Mantashe represent the alternative center. But what is critical for me is that the ANC center has collapsed or has split into multiple centers, and these multiple centers are coming into conflict with one another. One center or some centers are happy with what the ANC has become because they benefit from what the ANC has become. They benefit from the corruption. They benefit from the patronage. Some centers want the ANC to move in a different direction, despite the fact that some of them may have benefited from the same corruption and from the same patronage. But now, in order to survive beyond the Zuma presidency, they are seeing the need to delink the interests of the party from the interests of the president. Hence, you now hear the ANC saying it is wrong to reinstate Brian Molefe as ESCOM CEO. And in my view, they are correct. Because while it may not be unlawful to reinstate Brian Molefe as ESCOM CEO, the circumstances under which he left ESCOM and the circumstances under which he is coming back now stink to high heaven. In fact, what the ESCOM board must answer is whether, one, Molefe resigned or took early retirement. Secondly, if he took early retirement, what provision did they use in their policies to grant him early retirement? Because as far as I understand, one has to be 55 before he takes early retirement at ESCOM. And he only turned 50 in December last year. There can only be one explanation for why the ESCOM board was so unlawfully generous or generously unlawful in granting someone who does not qualify early retirement, as they did in the case of Brian Molefe. And that one reason is corruption.
Democratic Alliance leader Mmusi Maimane recently said President Zuma has been a distraction that South Africans have had sometimes to the detriment of other issues we ought to be looking at. Do you agree with that statement?
What he's saying in part is true, but what is also partly true is that what he is doing is a case of the kettle calling the pot black. His party has spent, and he himself have spent a lot of time focusing narrowly on President Jacob Zuma and forgetting that Jacob Zuma and the ANC do not constitute the totality of what is wrong with our post-apartheid reality. And therefore, if we are to change what is going wrong in South Africa, we must change those things that have gone wrong because of the ANC and President Jacob Zuma. But we must also change those things that fall outside the mistakes, the failures, and the weaknesses of the ANC and President Jacob Zuma.
That was political analyst Aubrey Majiki speaking to Crema Media's Polity about his latest column titled The Unravelling of Jacob Zuma.